My name is Kizerli, and today I'll be discussing Dr. Huberman's podcast on working memory. So the topic he discussed was how to improve working memory. So Dr. Huberman discusses the different forms of memory in this podcast, and by naming them specifically, working memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. He goes on to explain the information about these types of memories, delving deeper into the intricacies of each memory and how they affect our life, even if he only briefly touches upon it. Beginning with long-term memory, the first discussion or key point that I thought was important was that the concept of memory is usually associated with the idea of long-term memory. Now, just to connect this to something else, I have a question. I know the episode wasn't specifically about this, but I am curious as to how Alzheimer's can affect declarative and procedural memory differently. To my understanding, Alzheimer's majorly affects short-term memory due to the plaque buildup. However, my grandfather was able to perfectly retain his procedural memory. Sadly, though, his declarative memories were severely damaged. How could one be affected and another not? So I made this connection at 6 minutes 30 seconds. One more key point was brought up that there are actually two hippocampi inside the brain instead of one. I think this is very interesting because perhaps one hippocampi specializes in one for long-term memory, and the other hippocampi specializes in the other form. Moving on, he discusses short-term memory. Memory that is temporarily stored that may or may not be turned into long-term memory. At 9 minutes, he mentioned that the hippocampus was also extremely important for short-term memory. Branching off from my past point, perhaps one of the hippocampi are responsible for short-term memory, and one is for long. He also mentions that many of these functions depend on a network, but the core structure that is heavily responsible for short-term memory is the hippocampus. At 10 minutes and 11 seconds, another key point was brought up, and that is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is mentioned as one of the key factors that differentiate short-term and long-term memory from working memory. I remember from the memory unit in class that healthy neuroplasticity is one of the absolute best ways to avoid getting an Alzheimer's diagnosis. However, although he does say this, and so does the course content, my understanding does differ ever so slightly. My grandfather was actually a surgeon, and I expect that his neuroplastic levels were definitely very healthy, considering how much he had to use his brain to constantly learn new things and medical advancements as a doctor and slash surgeon well into his 60s. However, not long after he retired, he unfortunately got his Alzheimer's diagnosis. Of course, there are many factors that play into this, but it's just a thought that I had. And also one more thing, perhaps regarding the two different hippocampi. Perhaps one is used for short-term memory, one is long-term memory, as I said last time. That can make a connection to this as well. Moving on to the main topic of this podcast, working memory. Working memory, the key point that I found here is dictated by a neural circuit rather than neuroplasticity. He essentially stated that working memory is everything we do that we don't want to remember, such as tying shoes. When I did the memory test that he tested us on, I was fascinated as to how when he said a third string of letters, I couldn't follow along because I was so focused on remembering the first two. When I tried to memorize the third one, I was forgetting a few letters in the first string. I was sort of bummed out, but thankfully I found that as normal. One cool thing is that at 29 minutes 40 seconds, he said that dopamine has a major correlation to working memory, and that lower dopamine release has a correlation to worse working memory. Although he said that this is not always the case, and that there are more criteria to this than just dopamine release, I like to make a connection to my personal experience. One of my close family friends, who sadly passed away recently, was afflicted by both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Since Parkinson's is when the brain isn't able to produce enough dopamine, hence, which might lead to poor working memory, can this possibly lead to a diagnosis of Alzheimer's? disease regardless of amyloid plaque buildup. So I'm curious as for the connection between Parkinson's and Alzheimer's.